Sometimes the dreams we chase into the wilderness are the ones that end up rewriting our lives forever. When a man loses everything that once mattered and finds himself starting over at 41, even a forgotten cabin deep in the Montana mountains can look like salvation. Cole Maddox saved every quiet dollar he earned and walked away from the world below, choosing the silence of Snowpine Ridge. He hiked for miles through cold timber with Yukon at his side, carrying everything he had left on his back. Late autumn had settled over the Snowpine Mountains in that quiet, unforgiving way only Montana weather knew, where the wind whispered through the pines like an old spirit, and the dusk sky carried the color of steel dipped in lavender. Thin sheets of frost clung to every fallen branch, and the lonely ridges above Cliffhaven glowed with the pale light of an early winter that came sooner here than anywhere else. It was the kind of wilderness that swallowed sound, memory, and sometimes even people, a place vast enough to make a man feel both small and strangely understood. And for Cole Maddox, that lonely grandeur was the only world he trusted. Cole had lived alone on the eastern slope of Snowpine Ridge for nearly 5 years, tucked inside a weathered cabin framed by black firs and tall drifts of last season's snow. At 41, he had the kind of presence carved out of wind, stone, and sorrow. Broad-shouldered, steady, his beard clipped short but already silvering at the edges, his jawline set in that quiet way of men who had seen too much but asked for nothing. His eyes, a pale, glacial blue, never seemed to stop observing the world around him. They had a gentleness to them, though, something that didn't quite match the hardened lines of his face. When strangers caught their gaze, even in town where he rarely stayed more than 10 minutes, they always felt a flicker of something complicated, the weight of a man carrying more stories than he would ever tell. Before the mountains claimed him, Cole had been among the most respected rescue climbers in the state. Quick-thinking, steady-handed, the kind of man who would walk into a storm everyone else ran from. But the day he lost his fiancée in an avalanche stripped him of the certainty he once had. Her name had been Lila Hart, and every memory of her still carried the scent of pine needles and the echo of laughter bouncing off snowy cliffs. Cole had tried to save her. God knew he tried. But the mountain had moved faster than he could, swallowing her in a white roar that still visited him in dreams. After that, he left the rescue team, left the people who whispered they understood, and disappeared into Snowpine Ridge where grief could breathe without eyes watching it. His only companion since then, the only soul who could still pull a genuine sound from his chest, was Yukon, a 2-year-old Siberian husky with a coat thick as winter moonlight and markings in gray and charcoal that made his eyes look even more storm blue than Cole's. Yukon was young, but sharp as a cut of wind, energetic, intuitive, driven by a nose that caught even the faintest scent and a heart that rarely left Cole's side. The dog had a strange way of sensing Cole's moods, pressing his head against Cole's thigh on the quiet mornings when old sorrow crept in, or pacing at the window on the rare days Cole dared consider leaving the mountain. It was said that mountain men became reflections of their dogs, or that dogs became reflections of their men. In this case, both were true. Late one gray afternoon, as fog rolled low through the timber and the last of the sun struggled behind clouds swollen with snow, Yukon stiffened by the firewood pile beside the cabin. His ears pricked forward, nose lifting, body tensing into that peculiar mix of alertness and agitation that Cole had learned never to ignore. "What is it, boy?" Cole asked, his voice a low rumble softened by habit. Yukon didn't answer, of course, but gave a sharp, urgent whine, one Cole had only heard a handful of times, usually before storms or when injured wildlife wandered too close. Then Yukon pulled. Not just trotted ahead, but pulled, teeth catching the edge of Cole's flannel sleeve, tugging him toward the trees as though the dog believed time mattered. Cole grabbed his coat, slung his old canvas pack over his shoulder, and let Yukon lead. The forest swallowed them quickly, the world muted beneath the breath of fog as they cut through spruce stands and old game trails Cole knew like the grooves of his own palm. Yet Yukon wasn't following any trail Cole recognized. The dog veered north, toward ground Cole rarely crossed, thick with fallen trunks and bramble. The pull of instinct, not Cole's but Yukon's, kept them moving. Minutes stretched into almost an hour. When the fog thinned, they reached the rusted rails of the Montana Northern Spur, an abandoned train line no one had touched in nearly 30 years. The tracks cut across the forest like the bones of a forgotten age, cold metal half swallowed by moss and snow. Yukon slowed here, sniffing along the rail line before turning sharply left. Cole frowned. Nothing was supposed to be out this way. No cabins, no line shacks, not even ranger monitoring posts. He would have known. Snowpine Ridge had few secrets left from him. Yet as they continued, a shape emerged from the mist. A cabin he had never seen before. It stood crookedly on a small rise beside the tracks, wood darkened by decades of weather, its roof laced with thick ruffles of emerald creeping down like nature reclaiming what had been abandoned. The porch sagged slightly, steps warped and gray, but the structure held an odd kind of dignity, as though someone had once cared deeply for it. Cole's brows furrowed. This wasn't on any forestry map, he muttered. Yukon's tail stayed still, body tense, ears flicking at a faint sound Cole hadn't caught yet. As they neared, an unexpected detail made Cole's breath hitch. The front door was not latched tight, but left slightly ajar, swaying almost imperceptibly in the cold breeze. Yukon gave a low growl, not aggressive, but warning. Cole approached with caution, boots crunching softly against thin frost. He pushed a hand against the doorframe, intending only to nudge it closed for safety. Instead, the door opened further, but only an inch, just enough for two wide eyes to appear from the shadows inside. A girl, no older than 9. Her hair was tangled, cheeks hollow from cold and fear, and she clutched the edge of the doorway as though it were the last thing anchoring her to this world. Her voice cracked when she spoke.
Mister, you're not a bad man, right?
Her question trembled through the fog like a fragile thread, and something in Cole's chest, something buried beneath years of winter, shifted. Yukon's posture softened almost instantly, tail lowering but no longer stiff. Even he sensed the child wasn't a threat. Cole steadied his voice, letting its calm carry through the doorway. "No," he said, gentle but firm. "No, sweetheart, I'm not." And in that suspended moment, with fog curling around them and the mountains standing silent witness, Cole felt the strange pull of fate, subtle yet undeniable, as if Snowpine Ridge itself had reached out of its ancient stillness, placing this child in front of him to remind him that a man can only run from the world for so long. He didn't know her name, her story, or why she was alone in an abandoned cabin miles from any life. He only knew one thing. Whatever waited beyond that threshold, he wouldn't be turning away. Night settled thick over the abandoned cabin, its old timbers creaking softly, as if alive beneath the weight of the coming frost. And Cole Maddox felt the cold slip deeper into his bones as he crouched beside the doorway where the little girl trembled. The fog that had clung to Snowpine Ridge was thinning now, replaced by a colder, sharper darkness that pressed close against the windows. And Yukon stood rigid on the porch, ears pointed toward the endless pines like he could already hear trouble coming long before the forest chose to reveal it. Inside, the girl steadied herself enough to speak, brushing a strand of tangled hair behind her ear. She was pale, perhaps from hunger or fear, with freckles scattered across her cheeks like faint constellations, and a stubborn set to her chin that reminded Cole of mountain kids he'd met years ago, children shaped by wind and hard luck. "My name is Marin," she whispered, glancing between Cole and Yukon as though still unsure which of them she should trust more. "Marin Ellis. I'm from Glenwood, in Wyoming." Her voice cracked at the end, and she pulled her worn jacket tighter around her small frame. Cole nodded gently, lowering his posture so he looked less like a looming stranger. "All right, Marin. How long you been out here?" She hesitated, chewing on the edge of her lip. "I came with my grandpa, Arthur Ellis. He used to work the rail lines a long time ago. Said he helped build part of the northern spur before they shut it down." Cole studied her carefully, noticing the subtle way her fingers trembled, not with winter's cold, but with that fragile brand of fear only children knew when they had been left alone too long. "Where's your grandfather now?" Marin's gaze traced the darkness beyond Cole's shoulder, as if hoping the trees would give her the answer she wanted. "A few nights ago," she began, voice small as a fading ember, "he said he needed to check the light inside the mountain." She swallowed hard. "He left after midnight, and he didn't come back." The phrase unsettled Cole, light inside the mountain, and though he didn't flinch, something instinctive tightened in his chest. Snowpine Ridge had its share of strange tales whispered by old-timers over coffee in Cliffhaven, stories about odd glows in the canyons or sounds rising from closed tunnels where accidents once happened. Cole had always chalked it up to superstition, but now, hearing it from this child's lips, he felt the old mountain shift around him in ways he couldn't explain. He motioned gently for her to move aside, then stepped into the cabin, letting the dim lantern glow guide his eyes. The place was small, one room partitioned by a half wall with a narrow cot, a potbelly stove, and shelves stuffed with old tins and bundles of dried herbs. Yukon followed, nose low, tail straight, in wary silence. Cole scanned the cabin. Nothing looked ransacked or disturbed, but there was a sense of something unfinished in the air, as if Arthur Ellis had left in a hurry, certain he would return before dawn. On the wooden table lay a folded map, yellowed, edges frayed. Cole recognized the outline, the Montana Northern Spur Rail System, the line long abandoned and rarely acknowledged even in modern forestry documents. But this map held additions in a different hand, thick black pencil, shaky in places, circling areas deeper in the ridge. Near the southern portion of the rail, an old tunnel number was marked and underlined twice. Tunnel 47. Yukon's low growl rumbled from the far side of the cabin, pulling Cole closer to where the dog stared at the floor near the narrow cot. Cole crouched, lifting a dusty tin box shoved beneath the bed. Inside, a small notebook sat atop a few rusted tools. The handwriting on the notebook's cover, sharp, deliberate, read, A. Ellis. Field Notes. Cole opened it. The pages were filled with symbols, strange notations, and fragments of phrases like SOS markers fading, resonance stronger at dusk, and something buried since '68. Cole felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. Men like Arthur didn't use words like resonance unless they believed they had proof of something. Tucked near the back, folded with care, was a letter addressed not to Marin, but to whoever found this cabin. Cole read it silently. If I do not return in time, please ensure Marin reaches safety. What I've set out to uncover has been hidden more than 50 years. It must be found before the wrong hands discover it first. Cole exhaled slowly, letting the weight of those words settle. Arthur wasn't wandering lost. He went somewhere intentionally, somewhere dangerous enough he wasn't certain he'd survive it. Before Cole could speak, Marin tugged lightly on the sleeve of his coat. "Grandpa said the mountain would show him something," she murmured, eyes brimming with a quiet fear older than her age. "Said the light wasn't natural. Said he'd seen it once when he was young, but no one believed him." Cole placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now. I promise." But even as he said it, Yukon stiffened again, this time with greater urgency. The dog moved toward the front of the cabin, planting himself in the doorway, body angled protectively toward Cole, fur rising along his spine, a warning growl building low in his throat. Cole extinguished the lantern with a swift motion and pressed a finger to his lips, signaling Marin to stay silent. The world outside the cabin had turned pitch dark, the kind of darkness that felt almost physical, pressing against the cabin walls. Beyond the porch, the forest whispered with unfamiliar movement, branches shifting without wind, the faint crunch of something heavy crossing frost-thinned leaves. Cole's senses sharpened. Yukon never growled like that unless the threat wasn't a wandering animal. Something was out there, something deliberate, measured, searching. In that breathless hush, Cole realized the forest had gone completely silent, and the mountain, ancient, patient, knowing, seemed to draw closer around them. The danger Arthur feared hadn't died with the past. It had followed the old man's trail back into Snowpine Ridge, and now it was standing just beyond the door. The forest held its breath as Cole stood in the doorway of the abandoned cabin, Yukon stiff at his side, and Marin clutching her thin jacket like it was armor against the dark. Whatever moved beyond the porch faded back into the pines without revealing itself, leaving only the hush of night and the soft tremor of fear lingering in its wake. And Cole knew they couldn't stay. He should have taken the girl straight to Cliffhaven from the start, should have ignored the chill in the air that hinted at something unnatural stalking the ridge. But as he watched Marin blink away the tears that threatened to fall, he understood that hesitation now would cost them more than a cold night. He tightened the strap of his pack. "We're moving," he said quietly, and the girl nodded, gripping his sleeve for the first time. They left the cabin behind, its windows gleaming faintly like tired eyes sinking into the fog, and started toward the main trail Cole usually took back to town. The moon was thin and pale, barely lighting the snow-dusted path, but Yukon guided them with the sure instinct of a creature tied deeply to the pulse of the wilderness. For a while, the only sounds were the crunch of their steps, the soft rasp of pine needles under Yukon's paws, and Marin's unsteady breathing as she tried to keep up with Cole's long strides. "Did you know him?" she whispered suddenly, as though the silence had grown too heavy. "My grandpa." Cole shook his head. "No, but men who work these mountains all carry the same look." "What look?" "The look of someone who's seen something nobody else believes." Marin didn't respond, but her small hand tightened around the strap of her backpack, a faded blue thing with peeling patches that looked like they'd once been stars and moons. Cole wondered what kind of childhood she'd lived before all this, before strange lights and abandoned cabins and missing grandfathers. They had traveled nearly 3 miles when Yukon stopped dead in his tracks. His tail went stiff, his nose lowered to the snow in one sharp motion, and he whined softly. A curious sound, not fearful, but focused. "What is it, boy?" Cole knelt beside him as Yukon pawed at the frost. There, half buried beneath a thin layer of new snow, was a footprint, large, deliberate, made by a heavy boot. Fresh. Cole brushed more snow aside, revealing another print, then another, forming a staggered trail heading northwest, away from the main route and deeper into Snowpine's densest timber. Marin sucked in a sharp breath. "I know those boots," she said, her eyes wide. "Grandpa's." He always said they made him walk louder than a bear. She forced a small, trembling smile, and Cole felt something shift inside him again, something old and painful, but also quietly determined. The right thing to do was to take her safely back to Cliffhaven. He knew that. Any ranger would say the same. But Cole hadn't been a ranger for a long time, and the sense of purpose he once carried, the same purpose he'd buried after Lila died, stirred now like a faint ember catching wind. Yukon nudged the prince, barking once as if urging Cole to decide. Cole exhaled, fog billowing like smoke from a long-neglected fire. "All right," he murmured. "We follow the trail." Marin let out a shaky breath of relief before she even realized she had been holding it. Cole led the way, Yukon pressing forward with renewed urgency, but as they moved, Cole's thoughts drifted, unbidden, into pieces of the past he rarely let surface. He remembered the day the avalanche took Lila, the howling wind, the radio static that drowned her voice, the sickening silence that followed. He remembered clawing through snow until his hands bled, refusing to accept what the mountain had already decided. And he remembered the moment he stopped believing he could save anyone ever again. Snowpine Ridge had swallowed the man he once was and returned him colder, quieter, and certain that no matter how strong or skilled he was, fate could still tear a life apart in a heartbeat. Yet here, now, with a frightened girl trusting him more than he trusted himself, Cole felt that old buried instinct, the one that ran deeper than grief, rise in him like thawing ground. They climbed steadily until the forest opened onto a ridge where the moonlight fell brighter, reflecting off something metallic partially hidden beneath the snow. Cole's breath hitched as he brushed it clean. Steel rails, rusted nearly to dust. The remnants of the Montana Northern Spur, an offshoot line that hadn't seen a locomotive in decades, curved along the mountain like a scar from another lifetime. Yukon walked the length of it, nose brushing the metal as though sensing the echoes of old storms and long-forgotten dangers. "Grandpa told me stories about this place," Marin whispered. "Said the trains used to carry miners through the ridge. Said sometimes they didn't all come back." Cole didn't doubt it. Old lines had their ghosts, and the deeper they went, the more he felt those ghosts pressing close. Another set of boot prints appeared beside the tracks, leading at the rise, growing more hurried the farther they went. Yukon bounded ahead, and Cole followed with Marin close beside him until they reached the top of the slope and saw it. A looming wall of stone where the mountain had sealed itself long ago. A tunnel entrance. Blocked. The archway was still visible, though crushed inward by time and collapse, and from the darkness behind the fallen rock came a faint draft of air, colder than the mountain wind and carrying a sharp scent, metallic, bitter, tinged with something chemical. Yukon whimpered, stepping back, nose wrinkling. Cole placed a hand on the stone, feeling the unnatural chill seep into his skin. Something had moved here recently. He could sense it, the way a storm senses lightning before it strikes. Marin hugged herself against the cold draft. Is he in there?" Cole didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the sealed tunnel, the boot prints, the broken stones disturbed near the base. He didn't know what Arthur Ellis had been searching for, but whatever it was in Tunnel 47. And the mountain wasn't about to give it up easily. Cole stood before the collapsed mouth of Tunnel 47 with the wind scraping against the stone like a warning whispered through clenched teeth. The night cold enough to sting the lungs with every breath. Marin huddled beside him, clutching her grandfather's worn backpack as if it were the last piece of him still warm. And Yukon prowled in slow arcs, tail stiff, sensing something beneath the surface of the mountain that unsettled even his seasoned instincts. Cole knelt and brushed away more snow from the wooden planks someone had hammered over the old entrance decades ago. And there, carved into the splintered surface, were the exact markings he had seen earlier in Arthur's notebook. But here, they glowed faintly, like they had captured moonlight and refused to let it go. 47. Keep out. Train, still inside. The handwriting was frantic, letters jagged, cuts running deep into the wood as though Arthur had carved them in desperation rather than preparation. Cole didn't like that feeling, of a man leaving warnings he was certain no one would heed. With a grunt, he wedged his crowbar beneath the first wooden brace. The moment it gave way, a current of air rushed out, sharp, cold, unnaturally cold, as though the mountain exhaled after holding its breath for 50 years. Marin shivered, not from the temperature, but from the strange resonance the air carried, a faint hum that made Yukon raise his muzzle and whimper in confusion. When Cole pulled the last beam free, the darkness inside the tunnel stirred, not visibly, but with a sensation, like the weight of buried history shifting on its side. The three of them stepped inside, their footsteps echoing off stone walls left untouched since the last miners abandoned them. Cole turned on his flashlight. The beam cut through swirling dust to reveal the tunnel's floor, trembling ever so slightly, like the earth held memory of an engine that once thundered across these tracks. And then there was the light, thin, blue, and shimmering in pockets along the walls, like luminescent fog trapped in cracks of stone. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate, but enough to unsettle, dancing like ghost fire when Yukon moved through it. "Is it alive?" Marin whispered. Cole didn't answer. He didn't know. This place felt wrong, not dangerous the way cliffs and storms were dangerous, but dangerous the way time was dangerous when it bent or repeated itself. From deeper inside the tunnel came a sound, so faint Cole thought he imagined it at first. A long, distant horn. The cry of a train. He froze, listening again. There it was, far away, barely audible but undeniable. The Montana Northern Spur had been shut down since 1971. He'd seen the historical records himself, and yet something in these walls remembered. Cole moved forward slowly, guiding Marin behind him, keeping Yukon close as the dog's ears swiveled toward the sound. The deeper they went, the thicker the blue glow became, pooling along the sides of the tunnel like mist. Cole scanned the ground carefully. Bolts, old lantern shards, a piece of coal that crumbled under his touch. Then something else caught his eye, a metallic glint buried halfway in the soil. He knelt, brushed away debris, and lifted a pocket knife, its brass handle worn smooth from age and a small engraving catching the beam of the flashlight. To Arthur, from Ella, 1969. Marin gasped. Her trembling fingers reached toward the knife but hesitated midair as though afraid it would vanish like the glow surrounding them. "Mom said Grandma Ella died before I was born," she whispered. She gave him that knife when he retired from the first rail job he ever had. Cole closed his hand around the knife, feeling an ache he hadn't expected, not for Arthur, whom he barely knew, but for Marin and the hollow space in her voice where hope and fear collided. He slipped the knife into his coat. "He dropped this not long ago," Cole murmured. "Maybe only hours. He was here." Marin nodded, tears threatening her composure but never fully falling. They kept walking, deeper into the tunnel until the cold grew sharper. Not a winter cold, but a cold that felt like stepping into someone else's memory. Marin, seeking distraction from the terror creeping beneath her skin, asked quietly, "Cole, when you said you lost someone, what was her name?" Cole stiffened. He didn't talk about Lila. He rarely even spoke her name aloud anymore. But now, in this tunnel that hummed with the echoes of old lives and unfinished journeys, hiding the truth felt like denying the pain that tied him to Marin's grief. "Lila," he said quietly. She was the kind of person who made the mountains seem softer. Like winter wouldn't dare hurt her. The faintest smile touched Marin's lips. "That sounds like my Grandma Ella." Cole swallowed. He continued, voice low and steady. "I was supposed to save her. That was my job. But there are storms you can't outrun, and avalanches don't care who they take." Marin looked at him with eyes far older than her years. "Grandpa used to say the mountain chooses who it keeps." Cole huffed a soft, humorless breath. "Yeah. Mine chose wrong." But speaking it aloud, sharing the quiet burden he'd carried alone, felt strangely like relief, a thread woven between them in the cold darkness. The blue light around them flickered unexpectedly, like a pulse skipping a beat. Yukon's ears shot up. Then, without warning, the Husky's fur bristled from shoulders to tail. He planted himself between Cole and the tunnel's entrance, facing the darkness behind them, and let out a single, sharp, guttural howl. Not a warning to danger near them, no. This was a call announcing something was already here. Something moving toward them from the mouth of Tunnel 47. Cole turned sharply toward the tunnel entrance, flashlight trembling in his grip as Yukon's warning howl echoed along the stone ribs overhead, and before he could position himself between Marin and the danger, 3 silhouettes spilled into the dim blue glow, broad-shouldered, fast-moving, and wrapped in striking red coats that seemed to swallow the pale light around them. They stepped over fallen rock like they'd crossed this tunnel 100 times before, their boots thudding with a rhythm too practiced for hikers and too deliberate for lost wanderers. As they moved closer, the details sharpened. Each man had the same cold-eyed focus, the same stiff-jawed expression of someone doing a job he didn't like but had no choice but to finish. Their breaths puffed in white bursts, and the tallest, dark-browed with skin weathered like bark and a deep scar running along his jaw, carried a metal detector, not used for forestry surveys but for heavy industrial scanning, the kind Cole had only seen used in salvage work and abandoned rail cleanups, and even then, only when searching for steel. "Evening," the scarred man said, his voice flat as gravel. "Strange night for a stroll in a restricted area." He raised the detector slightly, almost casually, but not quite. Cole saw the lie instantly. "That's not forestry gear," Cole said quietly. "You're not surveyors." The man smiled without warmth. "Depends what we're surveying." Before Cole could reply, Marin stepped back, accidentally knocking a loose stone, and the clatter betrayed her presence. One of the men, a younger one with nervous, twitching hands and a sandy beard, snapped his head toward her. "Hey, that's the girl!" Cole shifted protectively, but Marin's fear overcame caution, and her voice cracked through the cold tunnel air before she could stop herself. "My grandpa told you never to come back here," she shouted, fists trembling at her sides. "He said, you're the reason the train disappeared. You made it happen." The men froze. For a beat, the tunnel held a silence so tight it felt like the whole mountain was listening. Then the scarred leader muttered a curse under his breath. "Great." The old man talked. The sandy-bearded one stepped forward a half-step. "We can't let her get near the train. If she sees it, shut it," the leader snapped. But it was too late. Cole had heard everything he needed, and the glint in the leader's eyes confirmed a truth uglier than anything Cole had imagined. The disappearance of the Montana Northern Spur train in 1971 had never been an accident. It had been erased, buried, hidden. And now Someone was desperate to keep it that way. "You're leaving," Cole said quietly. "Now." The leader chuckled, a low, humorless sound that bounced cold off the tunnel walls. "We're not here for you, Mountain Man. We're here for what's down this tunnel. And since you've wandered into the wrong story, we're going to have to ask you to step aside." Yukon snarled and lunged forward a single step, hackles rising like bristles of steel. The men flinched, just enough for Cole to feel the shift of momentum. He grabbed Marin's hand. "Run!" They sprinted deeper into the tunnel, Yukon bounding ahead like a streak of living snow. Behind them, shouts erupted, boots pounding against the stone as the three red-coated men gave chase. Cole didn't look back. The air grew colder as they pushed deeper, the tunnel's eerie blue glow thickening into veils of fog that shimmered like frost caught in moonlight. Marin clung to Cole's coat, struggling to keep pace, but she didn't stumble, not once. She moved like a child used to surviving things she shouldn't have had to. "Keep close!" Cole barked, breath fogging in front of him. The tunnel widened suddenly, opening into a cavernous chamber where the air felt old and electric, pulsing with every footstep. And then they saw it. The shape. Massive, motionless, looming under a blanket of frozen mist. A train. An entire train, sitting exactly as it must have sat the day it vanished, every window frosted, every metal plate shimmering under a paper-thin coat of glassy ice. Its engine loomed like a sleeping beast trapped in time, untouched by decay, as though someone had plucked it from 1971 and laid it gently into the present. Marin gasped, her voice sucked away by the cavern's vastness. Cole felt the hair on his arms rise, not with superstition, with recognition. This was not a haunting, not a myth. This was history, preserved, suspended, and unnervingly whole. How is it still here?" Marin whispered. Cole didn't answer. He didn't know how to. He only knew that everything in him rebelled at what lay before them, the metallic tang in the air, the unnatural cold radiating from the train's metal frame, the quiet hum that vibrated faintly beneath their feet like a memory refusing to die. Footsteps thundered behind them, and the red-coated men burst into the chamber. The leader's face twisted with fury when he saw the impossible artifact sprawled under the shimmering frost. "I told you!" he shouted at the others. "Don't let them get near it!" The sandy-bearded one hesitated, eyes flicking toward the train's sealed doors with something like fear. "It's really still here. God help us, he was right. The old man was right." "Shut up and grab them!" the leader roared. Cole stepped backward, shielding Marin, Yukon growling a low, lethal rumble that echoed off the ancient steel walls. But Cole barely heard the shouting anymore, barely registered the pounding footsteps. His entire being was locked onto the train, the frozen monument to a half-century conspiracy. The truth wasn't just buried. It had been entombed inside the mountain, kept alive, waiting. And now, it had been found. Cole pressed himself and Marin against the side of the cavern wall, keeping Yukon tucked close as the red-coated men searched the chamber, their voices ricocheting across the frozen metal surfaces of the impossible train. The shimmering blue fog pooled thicker near the sealed doors of the third car, blowing just enough to make the frost appear alive, and Cole felt that strange trembling beneath his feet again, as if the mountain's pulse was tied to the slumbering engine. When the red-coated men veered toward the first and second cars, Cole seized the moment. "This way," he whispered, tugging Marin toward the third car, the only one whose door seemed slightly ajar, though still crusted with decades of ice. Yukon squeezed through first, his breath forming pale clouds, ears swiveling with quiet urgency. Cole wedged his hand along the frozen seam, gritting his teeth as the metal stung his skin, and with one brutal pull, the door slid open enough to let them slip inside. The temperature dropped instantly. The air smelled like rust, dust, and something chemical that clawed faintly at the back of the throat. "Stay close," Cole murmured, sweeping his flashlight across the abandoned interior. Rows of crates, stacked precisely, stamped with faded insignias and military markings, lined the length of the car. The stenciling was barely visible beneath frost, but Cole recognized the format. Department of Defense hazardous material codes used in the late 1960s. Why would a passenger line carry this? He muttered to himself. Yukon pawed at one crate, then trotted ahead, nose twitching fiercely as though the scent inside the metal walls stirred some instinctual alarm he couldn't ignore. Cole lifted a rusted latch, pried open a crate, and recoiled slightly at the contents. Sealed cylinders arranged in rows, each bearing warning symbols. Not commercial cargo. Not a supply shipment. Something meant never to see daylight again. Marin's voice trembled. "Grandpa said the train wasn't supposed to stop. He said something went wrong." Cole opened another crate, then another, until the truth settled into him with a weight colder than the frost around them. The train carried chemical waste. Highly toxic, likely wartime remnants meant to be destroyed or buried. And somehow, instead of being disposed of safely, it had been diverted into Snowpine Ridge, hidden inside a mountain where no eyes would ever find it, if not for Arthur Ellis. Cole moved deeper into the rail car, Yukon at his heels, until he found a small metal desk bolted to the floor. Papers lay scattered across it, glued in place by layers of ice. Cole scraped frost away with his knife and uncovered a leather-bound book worn soft with age. The embossed title read, Conductor's Journal, Montana Northern Spur. Cole opened it, pages stiff but legible. The entries told a story not meant for the public, of orders changed without explanation, of military personnel accompanying the crew, of heated arguments overheard between officials. Then a final entry froze Cole's breath mid-chest. Diversion confirmed. We enter Snowpine Ridge at dusk. If the brakes fail here, the wreckage will be impossible to retrieve. We've been assured this line will be shut down. If derailment occurs, the valley will not survive the spill. God help us if anything goes wrong. Cole swallowed, flipping to a small envelope tucked between the pages. A letter, sealed but never sent. He opened it with care. If this train derails, Snowpine Valley will never be safe again. Should anyone read this, understand, this was not an accident. It was an order. The words struck like a fist. Someone had planned for the train to vanish, someone powerful enough to silence an entire crew. Cole clenched the letter as Marin stepped to his side, her small hand brushing the edge of the journal. "Grandpa, he saw something that night, didn't he?" Cole nodded slowly. He must have been working nearby. He heard the crash or saw the lights. Maybe he tried to help the crew. Maybe he saw what they were carrying. Marin looked down at her worn boots, her breath trembling. "He told me once, when I was little, that some truths don't die. They just wait for someone brave enough to wake them up." She looked up again, eyes shining with fear and determination. "He said truth sleeps, not dies." Cole felt something shift inside him. Not the ache of loss he'd carried for years, but something gentler, warmer. He rested a hand on Marin's hair, brushing away a strand of frost. "And sometimes," he whispered, "truth chooses the person who wakes it." The moment felt impossibly fragile, suspended inside a rail car frozen in time, but also real in a way that settled into Cole's chest like warmth returning to numb fingers. He hadn't expected to feel anything this deep again, not after Lila, not after burying himself in the mountains. But Marin's courage, her fear, her fragile hope, it stirred something long buried. Yukon growled softly, the sound low, uncertain, more warning than threat. Cole stiffened. The men had entered the first rail car. He could hear their muffled voices distantly. They hadn't reached the third car yet. But they would. And when they did, they would destroy anything or anyone that could expose the truth Arthur died trying to reveal. Cole tucked the conductor's journal and the unsent letter into his pack. Evidence. Proof. The very thing Arthur came back for after all these years. "We need to move," Cole said. "Now." Marin nodded, and Yukon pressed close, his body trembling, not from fear, but from the strange energy humming through the metal floor. Cole took one final look at the frozen car, the toxic cargo meant to vanish in the mountains, and the truth Arthur had dragged himself back into Snowpine Ridge to confront. He'd spent years believing he could never save anyone again. But tonight, with the mountain thrumming around them and a child looking to him like he was the last person in the world who could make things right, Cole felt the spark of something he thought had died with the avalanche. Purpose. And maybe, faintly, just faintly, faith. Cole tightened his grip on Marin's arm the second he heard the crunch of boots closing in behind them, the harsh echoes of the red-coated men bouncing off the metal ribs of the frozen train like distant gunshots. He shoved her into a narrow crevice between rusted beams and fractured stone, barely wide enough for a small child and a trembling husky. "Hold on to Yukon," he whispered, voice low but firm, brushing a hand over the dog's head. "Whatever happens, don't let him leave your side." Marin nodded, eyes wide, clutching Yukon as though he were the only anchor keeping her from slipping into the fear swallowing the tunnel. Cole stepped away from them, positioning himself in the open as the red-coated men reached the rear of the rail car. The storm outside had begun to push its way into the cavern, a frigid wind drawing ghost-like howls through the long throat of the tunnel, low, hollow, and eerily similar to the mournful call of an old locomotive. Snowflakes spiraled inward, glittering like shards of broken starlight. The leader of the red-coated men spotted Cole and raised a hand to signal the others. "There he is," he shouted. "Don't let the girl get away." His voice cracked at the end, not with anger but with something bordering on panic. Cole didn't have time to wonder why. The younger man with the sandy beard lunged first, swinging a metal detector like a club. Cole dodged, the blunt force whistling past his cheek, and he drove his shoulder into the attacker's ribs. The impact reverberated off the sealed rail car, but the man recovered quickly, snarling as he charged again. Cole ducked a second blow, grabbing the man's coat to throw him off balance, but before he could, the ground trembled beneath them. Not the faint vibration they'd felt earlier. This was stronger, a deep, thrumming pulse, like the heart of the mountain had awakened. And from somewhere inside the dead train, a filament of blue light flickered, thin at first, then widening into a trembling halo that shifted like liquid flame. The light spilled across the frost-coated floor, sliding over metal and stone until it reached the battling men. Cole froze, not in fear, but in awe, because the light didn't just illuminate, it hummed, alive with an energy that made the hair on his arms rise. The sandy-bearded man screamed and stumbled backward, dropping his metal detector as though it had suddenly caught fire. "Get away from that glow!" he shouted, voice cracking. "That's what warped the field! That's what did it to the train!" The leader growled. Don't panic. Just stay clear of... But he didn't finish because the light pulsed outward in a violent ripple, shaking Frost loose from the ceiling and overtaking the entire cavern in a cold, shimmering haze. Yukon lunged from the crevice, barking fiercely, intercepting the third red-coated man just as he tried to seize Marin's arm. The Husky clamped onto the man's sleeve, pulling him off balance, and Marin used the moment to scramble out of his reach. Cole seized the opportunity. He drove forward, ramming the sandy-bearded man into the side of the rail car, then swung his elbow into the man's jaw. The attacker crumpled, dazed. The leader swore loudly and backed away, shielding his face from the trembling blue radiance spreading over the ground like a tide. "You idiots!" he shouted at his men. "Don't let them near that thing! Don't let them—" The rest of his command drowned beneath the roar of the storm surging through the tunnel. Outside, the blizzard had reached full fury, its wind roaring through the entrance like a canyon beast awakened. Snow slammed through the tunnel mouth in blinding sheets, swirling with the strange blue particles that now drifted off the train like sparks from an otherworldly forge. Cole didn't question it, didn't need to. He pulled Marin close, grabbed Yukon's scruff and sprinted toward the far end of the chamber where a narrow service passage sloped upward toward the mountainside. The leader lunged after them, but Yukon turned, snarling like a creature twice his size, forcing the man to hesitate. It was only a moment, but exactly the moment Cole needed. He pushed Marin ahead of him. "Climb!" The wind howled around them, sucking air through the tight stone passage, turning it into a tunnel within a tunnel. Their breath tore from their lungs as they fought against the blizzard's pull. The walls shuddered. Snow roared. The blue light behind them intensified, painting everything with an icy glow. Cole risked one glance back. The men in red coats were stumbling, shielding their faces as the strange radiance crawled up their boots, distorting the air around them. Their voices echoed in broken fragments. "Electrostatic. Field. Unstable. Get back!" But Cole didn't wait to see what happened next. He shoved Marin upward, guiding her through the rising snow. The wind thickened around them until it became a white wall, its force so violent it blurred the edges of reality. Then, suddenly, they burst through the top of the passage into blinding daylight. A ridge of jagged stone curved overhead, and snow cascaded down the slope in sheets of white fire. Cole steadied Marin against the wind. "Keep moving!" Through the swirling chaos, a shape appeared. Dark green uniform, fur-lined hood, snow goggles pushed up onto a familiar face. Laurel Bennett. Her breath hitched when she saw him. "Cole?" Her voice broke with disbelief and relief all at once. Behind her, 2 rescue rangers struggled against the storm, waving orange signal flags. "We saw an SOS signal carved into the snow from the helicopter," she shouted, stepping closer. "Did you send—" Then she saw Marin, then Yukon. Then the terror etched into Cole's expression. She pressed a hand to her chest. "Cole! Oh, God, what have you walked into?" Cole couldn't answer. The words caught in, the storm between them. But Laurel stepped forward anyway, placing her gloved hand on his arm, the gentlest touch he'd felt in years. "I knew it," she whispered, voice trembling. "I knew you were still a man who saves people." The warmth in her eyes, fragile and fierce all at once, cut through the cold like the first spark inside a long, dark hearth. And Cole felt something inside his chest, the place, frozen for far too long, begin to thaw. The storm had broken by the time the rescue team guided Cole, Marin, and Yukon down the ridge, leaving behind a sky washed pale gold by the first light of morning, as if the sun itself were too stunned to rise in full strength after what had unfolded beneath the mountain. Laurel Bennett walked beside Cole, her green ranger coat streaked with frost, her hair wind-tangled beneath her hood. and though she spoke crisply into her radio as they descended, her glances toward Cole carried a softness he hadn't seen in years. Something cautious, something warm, something like familiarity rediscovered. When they reached the staging area at the base of Snowpine Ridge, the quiet valley had transformed. Federal trucks lined the clearing like metal beasts awakening in the dawn. Agents in thick jackets marked with emergency insignias moved with careful urgency, cordoning the tunnel entrance and examining samples of strange blue frost clinging to their gloves. The three red-coated men, now stripped of their false credentials, were handcuffed beside one of the trucks, their expressions hollow, resigned, as though they had finally realized the mountain had turned against them. Yukon padded forward, ears raised, then barked at the men in a sharp, scolding way that made several agents chuckle under their breath. "Guess he's got opinions about saboteurs," one ranger muttered. Cole didn't smile, but his hand rested on Yukon's head, steady and grateful. Marin stood beside Cole, wrapped in a blanket one of the paramedics had given her, watching the commotion with wide eyes that held a complicated mix of hope and dread. She tugged Cole's sleeve. "Do you think they found him?" Her voice was thin, nearly swallowed by the wind. Cole knelt to meet her gaze. "If he's alive in there, they'll bring him out." The words were meant to comfort, but Cole felt the uncertainty twist under his ribs. Snowpine Ridge did not give back easily. It took its time. It chose. And then, as if the mountain wished to answer before doubt settled too deeply, a shout rose from the direction of the tunnel. "We've got someone! Still breathing!" The world seemed to narrow around Marin as she sprinted toward the sound, Yukon racing at her heels. Cole and Laurel followed quickly, weaving between agents until they reached the mouth of the tunnel where two responders were carrying an older man on a stretcher. Frail, pale, with a face carved by years of wind and grit and sorrow. His beard was white as frost, his cheeks hollow, but his eyelids fluttered, and his fingers twitched like a man still fighting to hold on to the world. Arthur Ellis. Marin nearly collapsed in relief, falling to her knees beside him. "Grandpa! Grandpa, it's me!" The old man's eyelids quivered, then opened slowly. His pupils struggled to focus at first, then settled on her, the recognition blooming like a slow dawn. His hand lifted shakily, brushing her cheek. "Marin." His voice was thin, cracked by cold and dehydration. You really came." The paramedic urged her to give them room, but Arthur raised his hand as though the effort alone could halt the entire rescue team. "Let her stay," he whispered. "Please." They made an exception. Marin leaned close as Arthur tried to swallow, his voice fading in and out like a weak radio signal. "In the dark, when the cave-in trapped me, I saw it again." Cole and Laurel exchanged a look, part fear, part wonder. Arthur continued, breath trembling. "The light. The blue one. I don't know what it is, nobody does, but it kept the cold from taking me. It kept the train from rotting. It kept me alive." Marin clutched his hand, tears carving pale tracks through the grime on her cheeks. "It's okay, Grandpa. You're safe now." Arthur nodded faintly, eyes drifting toward Cole. You found the truth." Cole only inclined his head. He didn't trust his voice, not with the weight of what Arthur had endured sitting like a stone in his chest. The federal agents swarmed then, documenting every detail of the tunnel collapse, the hazardous cargo, and the preserved train. The three men in red coats confessed under pressure, naming the officials who decades ago ordered the train buried, explaining how the cover-up had been passed down through silence and threats. Snowpine Ridge had carried this secret for half a century, guarding it like something sacred or cursed. As the sun climbed higher, softening the jagged edges of dawn, Laurel stepped closer to Cole, where he stood a little apart from the bustle, watching Marin and her grandfather reunited beneath a sky turning the color of new wheat. She nudged him gently with her shoulder. "You okay?" He exhaled, a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "It's been a long time since I walked toward something instead of away." Laurel studied him for a moment, her green eyes bright in the morning light. "You were never meant to stay gone, Cole. People like you, mountain folk, you don't disappear. You just wait." She smiled, soft, earnest, with that familiar curve he remembered from years ago when life had been simpler. "And sometimes," she added, "you wait for the right reason to come back." Yukon barked once, tail wagging, as if declaring the point settled. Marin, still beside Arthur's stretcher as the paramedics prepared to move him, turned to Cole. "Mr. Cole, the blue light in the tunnel, was that magic?" The question hung in the cool air, fragile and honest. Cole looked toward the ridge, toward the snow-laden peaks catching the first full strength of the sun, toward the mist curling up like an old spirit drawing its first breath after a long slumber. He felt something inside him ease, something long frozen, now beginning to thaw under the warmth of connection, purpose, and second chances. "Out here," he said softly, "there are things folks don't have names for." Marin watched him waiting. Cole placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "But today, the only miracle I needed was that we're all standing in the same sunlight." The wind brushed over them then, gentle, warm, carrying with it the faintest echo of what might have been a distant train whistle, soft and peaceful, as if Snowpine Ridge itself were offering a blessing. And somewhere beneath that rising dawn, a new beginning took root, for Cole, for Yukon, for Marin, and for Laurel Bennett, whose smile lingered beside him like the promise of spring after a brutal winter. In the weeks that followed, the mountains around Snowpine Ridge softened back into their quiet rhythm. The wind whistled through the pines like an old hymn, and the land breathed in slow patience, the way only wilderness knows how. Cole often found himself standing at the ridge at dusk, Yukon pressed against his side, watching the sunset bleed gold and copper across the sky. Sometimes Laurel joined him. Sometimes Marin brought Arthur's old notebook to read aloud in her small, steady voice. Life did not return to what it once was. It rarely does. But it found its way back to something gentler, something good. And every now and then, when the light slanted just right through the morning frost, Cole saw a faint shimmer deep within the tunnel's mouth, as if the strange blue glow had not entirely faded, only settled into the bones of the mountain like a secret shared. He never tried to explain it. Some things are meant to stay between a ridge and the sky. One evening, as the last warmth of sun slipped behind the snowy crowns, Cole breathed deep and let the cold fill his lungs without fear. He thought of the train preserved by time, of a girl who refused to stop hoping, of an old man carried home by courage, and of the way a shattered heart can learn to beat again. Maybe it was chance. Maybe it was the mountain. Maybe it was something greater than both. Out here in the wild, Cole had learned that God does not always speak in thunder. Sometimes His grace shows up as a child's hand in yours, a dog who refuses to leave your side, or the soft return of trust when you thought you had lost that piece of yourself forever. And in that quiet truth, Cole found a kind of peace, a peace big enough to fill the valley, a peace strong enough to carry a man forward. The lesson is simple. Life will break us in ways we never expected. It will bury our strength, scatter our hope, and leave us wondering if we will ever stand again. But healing does not come all at once. It arrives in small mercies, in people who step into our darkness with a lantern, in moments when we choose courage even with shaking hands. And when we do, the world opens just enough for us to take the next step. If we keep walking, grace meets us on the trail. Always. If this story touched you in some way, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, to share your feelings or a moment that stayed with you. If you enjoy stories like this, you are warmly invited to subscribe so you will not miss the next journey into the mountains. May the Lord watch over you wherever you are tonight, protect your steps, and bring light to every quiet place in your heart.